Hi guys, and welcome. So I'm here today to kind of go over plate boundaries once again with you guys. So then hopefully you guys can retake and redo your plate tectonics test. So first up, let's talk about convergent boundaries. So if we were to make convergent boundaries with our hands, this is what is happening. So it's two plates, if my hands were two plates, coming together and sliding against one another. So, for example, if we have a consonant and a consonant coming together, all right, they're going to squish together and then they're going to create a mountain. So that's what this is representing here, a mountain. And we call that a folded mountain. So an example of that is when the Indian plate and the Eurasian plate come together, they form the Himalayan mountains, which is the same mountain range as Mount Everest, right? Okay. So that's convergent with consonant and consonant coming together, forming mountains. All right. Now, if we have a continent and an ocean coming together, what's going to happen is the ocean is going to slide underneath the continent, and that is called subduction. It is subducting underneath the continent. Why this happens is because the ocean is super, super dense, and it's also really small, so it's easy to kind of slide under there, right? Okay, so when a continent and an ocean come together, it creates coastal mountains. So as it's subducting, it's pushing up the continent a little bit to make mountains, and these mountains are typically volcanic. So a great example of it is the Pacific Ocean coming together with South America, and it creates the Andes Mountains. So if you look at a picture of South America, the entire western side has these huge mountains called the Andes, and they are indeed volcanic because of subduction. All right, next up in convergence, we have an ocean and an ocean coming together. Now, even though they both have the same densities and they're both around the same size, one ocean is going to have to slide under the other one because there's just not enough room. So what happens is one ocean slides under the other ocean and we have subduction happening, okay? Then all this stuff underneath, it starts to melt. It gets hot inside of our Earth's inside of our Earth's asthenosphere. It melts and it creates volcanic islands, okay? So it creates a string of volcanic islands. So a good example of volcanic islands would be the Caribbean islands or maybe Japan. So those are formed by two oceans coming together. Now, when we have subduction of two ocean plates, we end up with trenches as well. Because of the subduction, it basically makes like a little hole in the earth for a little bit. And so that's a good example of the Mariana Trench. Okay, so now a completely different form of plate boundaries is transform boundaries. And transform boundaries, there are boundaries that slide against one another. They're rubbing against one another. So they're going in opposite directions, and they're sliding past one another. So when they slide past one another, we get ginormous earthquakes and we get faults. Now, faults are like big cracks in the earth that break, okay? The best example of this in the United States is the San Andreas Fault. And so we get tons of earthquakes there and tons of giant breaks in the earth and or faults. All right. Last but not least is divergent boundaries. So divergent boundaries, if we were to show with our hands, is the separation of two plates. So they're pulling apart. So we can have a situation where we have a continent and a continent that are together and are slowly separating. Now what happens when we have a continent and a continent separating is we end up with a valley, a rift valley, okay? So quite literally, the space in between the two continents will get lower and lower and lower until eventually it fills in with seawater and they become two completely different continents or two completely different islands. So a great example of this is the Great Rift Valley in Africa. So the Horn of Africa is actually coming off and is creating a giant valley, a giant rift, and eventually Africa will be Africa, and then one part on the northeastern side of Africa will be a completely different island/continent. Okay, and last but not least, we can also have ocean-to-ocean divergence. So we can have two oceans together, they spread apart, but the thing is, oceans are so thin and so dense that when they come apart, it's so close to the asthenosphere, it's so close to the mantle that actually magma comes up when it's spreading. You know, it creates a rift, but the rift pulls apart even more, and we just have magma coming up. Now, when the magma comes up, it creates underwater mountains through a lot of time. So, when oceans and oceans diverge, we end up with underwater mountains. The best example of this is the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which we talked about in seafloor spreading. So the Mid-Atlantic Ridge is underwater mountains from when the Earth is separating and it's breaking out magma to create mountains. Okay, good luck on your checkpoint. Let me know if you guys need help.